democratic planning over the years and listened to many lead-offs about democratic planning, and I think there's a kind of standard format which one has, which is to describe in detail all the crises of capitalism and the problems which capitalism creates, and how terrible it is, and then to say, well, the alternative is to plan the economy instead. And that's basically it. Whereas, I mean, that kind of argument had some sort of weight behind it when there actually existed an alternative to capitalism in the form of the Soviet Union. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, that kind of method of arguing in favor of planning hasn't really had much success beyond the kind of comforting words for those that are convinced of the need for socialism already. And I think we have to take a different approach to the question. I think we have to understand, first of all, not the failures of capitalism, which are clear to everyone, especially in these days, what with the decline in the economy even being more rapid than it was in the Depression in the 1930s. And the unemployment rate has been rushing up, and of course the health crisis, which has exasperated the whole thing. So I don't want to go into how terrible capitalism is. What I want to look at is, why has capitalism been successful to start with? And I think Marx provided the basic answer to that, which is the functioning of the law of value. The law of value, that everything is exchanged at its labor value, its socially necessary labor value. And this provided an enormous dynamism to a system which has produced revolutionized the means of production time and time again since capitalism first started to spread throughout the globe. So why has the law of value been so successful in revolutionizing the means of production, that is, in increasing labor productivity, in making it possible to create more with less labor, which is the fundamental basis for all wealth in society, which is produced, is to be able to produce it with as little labor as possible. And I think the wonderful thing about the law of value is that it is a system which functions independently of those in charge of the system. It has an enormous capacity to pull together from all kinds of sources, to pull together the means of production and develop them. And this is what the fundamental force which develops capitalism is, also the centralization of production, the socialization of production, pulling together from various sources and creating an efficient method of producing things, at least far more efficient than the systems which have ever existed before capitalism, which is not to say that there cannot be a better system, an even more efficient system to replace it. So basically, saying that everything is exchanged at labor value is that everything has a price, and that the prices will signal, just as a matter of both Marx and the right-wing economist Hayek made the point, the pricing will signal for production where the production should move. So when prices are high, production will move in that direction, and that will lead to prices in that area going down. And vice versa, when prices are low, things will be pulled out of those methods out of production and put into more advanced techniques. And this is a fundamental driving force which created an enormous amount of wealth throughout the globe. Now, generally speaking, when one talks about the law of value and prices, they're a bit taken out of the social context, but Marx was clear also about this process called the socialization of production. And the initial unit of the socialization of production, which he talked about, was the factory itself. And let's remember, in the 19th century, most factories basically consisted of various artisans sitting at their machines, but being put under the same roof. And then you had somebody who was going around and then tried to get them to work harder. But basically, the artisans controlled the machines themselves. They controlled the means of production themselves. And that is why they kept extending the hours of work and controlling when you could go to the toilet and shortening the breaks and all the rest of it. That was the initial impulse of capitalism in the 19th century, because capitalism didn't actually control the actual capitalists didn't control the machinery. They could just put people into these factories. And that was a socialization of production at a very elementary level. Just simply taking artisans out of their cottages and putting them inside a factory, and therefore they could increase the efficiency of things. So that was the first step. But it also means that you gradually had an increase in knowledge which was beyond the pricing system. The socialization of the production means really an increase in knowledge, in management techniques, in centralization of knowledge and the development of knowledge generally. So that is, one could say in a certain sense, a counteracting factor to the law of value, where it wasn't just localized knowledge, but you began to get systematized and centralized knowledge developing throughout society. And the socialization of production has, of course, proceeded far beyond this very elementary type of socialization which Marx described. And when you get this centralization of knowledge and development of knowledge, you get an opposite process developing, which is the planning process. First, it's that simple planning of just how to put the machines in the factory and controlling people in that factory. But after a while, when socialization increases, you get greater and greater planning within bigger and bigger companies, which have more and more role to play in the economy. So planning is not something which we just can imagine in our heads and say, oh, we want this planning system, but we have all the elements of planning have begun to develop within the capitalist system itself, and removing things away from the law of value, because no companies, at least no successful companies, there have been a few failed attempts, introduced the law of value into the company itself. The few companies which have tried to do that have failed completely, because you have a superior method within the companies of developing production, which is planning. So as the economy socializes, the conditions, the planning itself increases. You have, even now, we've have a certain trend towards breaking up the global value chains. But basically, they're still in existence, but you have an enormous planning process within giant companies which extends around the globe. And that is an area where there is no law of value, where there is no market. The market is outside that and influences the planning within those companies. But within the company itself, there is no planning. It's the planning principle which is the decisive principle, and it has to react to the market. In a certain sense, one can call it, one has to plan for the market from within the company, because one can't ignore the market. So basically, I would say in most countries today, one has reached the stage where the dominant part of the economy is run by big companies that already planned within that company. And also their interaction with many other companies, smaller companies, subsidiary companies, is also planned already. But there is no general plan. And that is the step we have to take. That's the first step we have to take, is to ensure there is a general plan which links all the planning which is already taking place within the individual companies. And that general planning cannot take place unless the state actually owns these large companies. Without that, it can't take place. So that's the first step one has to take. But the actual concept of planning we have is very much colored by the experience of the Soviet Union, which is where planning meant something different than one finds in companies in the West. And I think it also means something different to what I think how a socialist economy should be planned. Because it meant when one centrally decided, or at least 6 million prices, it meant that one centrally decided what should be produced everywhere, how it should be produced, and when it should be produced. And this was a system, I would say, which was not efficient at all. It worked quite efficiently as a war economy. First during war communism, and then in the 1930s in the preparation for the war, which was going to come, and then during the Second World War, and to a certain extent during the Cold War in the 50s. It worked quite efficiently. At least it could collect a lot of surplus from peasants and destroyed the peasantry, and could take the surplus from the peasants in very brutal fashion, but it could centralize that surplus produced by the peasants and put it into industry, and therefore develop industry very rapidly by most often buying and at other times stealing technology which was developed outside the Soviet Union. But for example, the first car factory which was put in the Soviet Union was entirely bought from Ford automobiles in the 1930s. So they just took they basically copied a factory from the United States, and Ford put it in place, and then the Soviet Union paid for it. They basically never changed it after that. They just extended it. They never replaced that factory. They just built bits and bits onto it. So it got larger and larger until you had hundreds of thousands of people employed in that factory. but they never really developed the technology within those factories. They never really changed the structure of the factories, and that was a major factor contributing to the gradual stagnation of the Soviet economy. And I think a socialist economy must be a dynamic economy, especially in these times. It must be a dynamic economy when all kinds of new technology is necessary in order to solve environmental crisis, which is one of the main problems which we're confronted with today. So we can't just take some existing technology and then plonk it down and then expect the solution to be there. So that kind of planning was really a war-based economy. First, the basic outlines of it were developed during the war communism period and the Civil War, and then Stalin imposed it at a later stage. It was an economy which he was familiar with the bureaucracy, and in the Soviet Union was familiar with it, and it put them firmly in control of the situation, although it was not a very efficient system. And I don't consider that a planned economy, but I mean, they had 5-year plans, but none of the 5-year plans were ever ready in time for the actual beginning of the 5-year plan. The actual 5-year plan would be ready 1, 2, even 3 years after it was supposed to have begun. And the goals of the 5-year plan were never met either. So they were just like centrally bureaucratically decided things which it needed a big gray sector and a black market in the Soviet Union for the system to function. The gray sector was based upon companies bartering with each other. And then you had the black sector outside that. That was the only way in which they could actually make this kind of inefficient system work. Instead, I think we have to take over what has already grown into the dominant part of the economy. And we have to begin to coordinate that. And we can't coordinate the details of production. We can't coordinate the prices within that system. We have to start with the decisive question of coordination. And that is, where do the flows of investment go? If you control the flows of investment, you will control what parts of the economy develop and what parts of the economy don't develop. And of course, central to that is actually the ownership of the banks and the financial institutions to be able to control that, and to develop a 5-year plan, which says in what directions, what are the general direction of the economy we want to develop. And then to ensure that the finance is available for those parts of the economy to develop, and that there are state companies in those sectors which will take the initiative and which make long-term investments which will get results in those areas. That is simply said the basis of planning, of real planning, not pretense planning of the Soviet Union, which was really just commanding people, you know, produce more, produce faster, produce it earlier, and there was no feedback to the system. It didn't really, you know, whether you met the plans or not, it didn't really matter. In fact, there was a tendency to try and not meet the plans, because if you met the plans, then you knew that next time round you would be, the demand upon you would be to exceed, to get a higher goal to achieve. So there was an actual disincentive to meet the plans, the goals of the plan. So I think we have to take things quite straight and simple to gain control over the running of the economy. And the first steps, therefore, have to be to take control over the investment flows. And that cannot be done unless one controls and owns the biggest companies in the economy. Then the individual companies will deal with how to produce things, what technologies to use, what colors to use, or whatever. And that will be in response to a market which continues to exist. Politically speaking, what this means is not the abolition of the capitalist class. This was not something which Marx wrote about. Marx wrote about the dictatorship of the proletariat. What he meant by the dictatorship of the proletariat was that the proletariat becomes the ruling class. It has the decisive say over the direction of society. It does not mean that the other classes have been abolished, because you will the possibility of planning is connected to the socialization of economy. Unless you have a real and thorough socialization of the economy, you cannot have planning. You can have some bastardized version of it, and you can call it planning, but it's not really planning. So you need the socialization, and socialization of production is always uneven. In all capitalist countries, even the most developed capitalist countries, the majority of jobs are in small and medium companies. They're not in the big companies which actually dominate the economy. But they exist, and we can't simply abolish that. So the approach to planning must be to start with the most socialized sectors of the economy, control the investment flows in a conscious manner where we want the investments to go. And that will happen in interaction with a still existing market economy, which will consist of lots of small companies. But in order to get the dictatorship of the proletariat, you need not only political changes, but you need changes in the system of planning within individual companies too. And that means that for the larger companies, for example, the large state-owned companies, you need both a flow from below of control, but you also need the flow from the generalized interest of the entire plan in society as a whole from the top. And which should be democratically controlled, of course, politically. And not a question of establishing a one-party state, but of having a democracy which can decide what the government is and decide how the 5-year plan should, what the priorities of the 5-year plan should be. So you need that influence going into the running of the big companies. You need the influence of the workers in those companies going into the running of the companies, and which has already been developing to a certain extent in some companies, is you also need the influence of the general population, the consumers and so on, goes in the running of those parts of the companies. And through that, you get the dictatorship of the proletariat as an expression within these companies. It also makes the planning and running of those companies more efficient. As for the smaller and medium companies which are outside the state plan, there can be a gradual transformation of those into cooperatives, which would democratize those companies and also cooperatives tend to be more efficiently run than privately run. Well, they're still privately run because they're not part of the state ownership and they're not part of the state plan, the small and medium companies, but they would be democratized through a gradual process of cooperation as workers prepare to take them over as they grow. I think that's like the basic outline of a democratic planning, real planning, not illusionary planning, not commanding, but planning where you set goals, you get your feedback, you adjust yourself accordingly, and you develop it dynamically. Not just copying technology, not just copying the way of doing things, but actually in the continuous process of interaction, you get things developing. So with that, I think I'll leave it at that, and we can have the discussion. So I will.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, thanks, Jonathan, for that good introduction. On my side, I'm hoping that as the course of discussion develops, you didn't mention China at all, and I'm hoping that you could say something about how this general approach you put forward there links in with China. And also, just to add that we have we've collected up all the stuff you've written about planning in the previous versions of the manifesto that we were working on in the past, and we're going to, I hope you don't mind, but we're going to use large chunks of that stuff in the document we're working on, so that's okay. And plus also what the content of what you said today and the discussion. Okay, so any colleague like to ask a question or make a comment, add some thoughts? Fire away. Just go for it. Don't worry about putting your hand up, and remember to unmute yourself, otherwise we won't be able to hear you. Okay.
Well, if I could say something. Thank you, Jonathan. It was a really interesting and informative introduction, and I think it says a lot about what we can do and what we cannot do, because there is a real need of pinpointing the problems that a revolution faces when it comes to power, and we should never forget that this is what we are talking about. I mean, we are not talking about just a gradual transformation through a bourgeois government just taking over some companies here and there. We're talking about transformation of society. And I think that you rightly pointed out that unless we control, and by this I would put it in a stronger wording, unless we take over the banks and the big companies, then the whole exercise is pointless. I mean, we cannot expect to have to just leave them there and control the economy and pretend that we are doing any sort of plan. The second thing that I would like to put as a thought is that most of the management methodology has been developed to a very, very high extent within these companies, and it's wrong to think that we're just going to throw it away. I mean, we don't have to build everything from the beginning. It's just there for us to take over. And the main change that will happen is that if we are taken over by the state, then they will have just to jettison the profit motive from their thinking. And the rest, there won't be much change. I mean, instead of producing for profit, they would start producing for the common good. Now, this is tricky, and this has to be thought out and developed quite a lot more before we can understand what it exactly means. But one thing it certainly does mean that we cannot talk in any sense about capitalism in one country. I mean, if socialism prevails in one country, it will be a country under siege, and it will either win out the whole world or it will be crushed. I mean, if this was true in Lenin's time, it's 10 times as true today. And we can see that a country cannot even raise the taxes for the rich by itself. It just they just disappear everywhere else, and the country falls down. Even the question of tax levels in each country in the European Union is being resisted very fiercely by some countries because they want to cheat on each other. And so these are the sort of real things that I think we should also have in mind in doing this. Another thing that I would like to ask mainly is this question of efficiency and how we define it, because efficiency is something that in today's world is measured by how much profit someone can make. I mean, we couldn't possibly go along with this. We should have to redefine this, but to redefine it not abstractly on how we wish we would do it, but how it could work actually in the real economy when the state takes over the banks and the big companies, but when all the rest of the small and medium companies there remain capitalist. So this is something that I think it needs more developing. Well, this for the moment.
Thanks, Demos. Okay, fire away, comrades. Any comrades with questions or comments? Khalid, did you want to come in about any aspect of this? Or I saw you make a comment in the chat. Perhaps you'd like to explain that a bit more.
Hi, yes. Yes, I think it's just, I found this similar kind of analysis in Gramsci as well. Well, actually, I'm working on an article at the moment. And yes, I agree with John about this emphasis on reciprocality, the idea that, you know, the way in which policies are enacted and enforced should involve the bottom-up current as well as the generalized planning from the top, and this constant dynamic interaction between the two forces. And I will also add that there needs to be more work on consensus, and the consensus approach would obviously involve democratic planning, so democracy. And this, I think that's, I mean, as far as China is concerned, in principle, it's operating a democratic centralist government. So the idea of, you know, involving masses to get involved in the process of enacting policies. But other than that, but obviously in reality, we're seeing something rather different. And I'm hoping if, you know, comrades will be thinking along the lines of how to work, to make this work in practice. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, Joe. Khalid, did you want to say anything, or Sajjad maybe? Perhaps I'll try and throw something into this this discussion. I've tended to, I agree with everything that Jonathan talked about, and and I hope he'll comment on how this applies in the Chinese situation. But I think one of the big problems with the model of as it's turned out, of public ownership and planning, whether it's been in the West under social democracy, or whether it's been under the Stalinist planned economies in the East, has been the problem of bureaucracy and the resulting inefficiency, the top-down model, as opposed to involving any of the people in an effective way in the process. Now, I think if you're talking about planning a whole economy, first of all, we need a democratic media, not the capitalist media that exists at the moment, which is owned by the rich. We need a media which is actually controlled and is a voice of the people, and that would make a major difference, because then they would present things would be presented in a totally different way. And we'd have to do, we'd have to do experimentation to see how best we could, every 5 years, involve society in discussing the priorities of planning. What are the main emphasis of the new 5-year plan? Both in terms of there would be both in terms of production, but also in terms of public services. How much money is going to be spent on education, on health, and so on. And I'm sure in that context, obviously a lot of people would not want to be spending all the money that's currently being spent on arms and all sorts of other wasteful uses of money under capitalism. And that'll be interesting to see how you could actually make such subject matter accessible to people, and how they could participate in that discussion, and how they could express their viewpoints. And that would no doubt be done both through elected officials and, could be done in some form of direct voting on some aspects and so on. So that would be a very interesting thing in terms of the overall plan. But I'm also concerned about the day-to-day planning and operation of individual big parts of the economy or of public services. So, I think that the old model, so for example, if I can give a concrete example, we have, take for example, the National Health Service in Britain, and I'm sure it's a pretty similar situation all around the world. You've got a publicly owned health service, but it's not run by representatives of the medical staff, the patients, the families of the patients, the local communities. They have virtually no say in the running of the service. It's effectively run by the executive, the chief executive of the cabinet, who then, whoever is the Minister for Health, who then appoints the director of the health service, who then, in a pyramid style, top-down style, appoints all the officials down below. And so, of course, you've missed the opportunity of involving all the people who've got a direct experience of what's actually happening on the ground and are affected by all these decisions. And that can't be an efficient way of organizing things. So I think that one of the big things of planning, which is, because planning was very popular in the early days of the socialist movement, the concept of planning. If you read what socialists were saying at the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century. And every Labour Party member was inspired by this concept that that planning would overcome the chaos of capitalism, and the planning in the public interest would replace the narrow short-term greed of the capitalists for their own benefit. But they didn't consider really how it would be carried out in practice, and the big problem has been that planning is now seen in too many cases as a kind of a bureaucratic process, and in fact almost like a series of obstacles. So for example, if most people's experience of planning is where they want to do something to their house. Maybe they want to add, extension to the back of their house, or they want to change the look of the house at the front or something, and they've got to apply to their local council, who then will send the application through to their planning department, who will then raise a whole series of objections about the thing potentially, and maybe they'll say no, you can't do this, or you can do this, and so on. So that's probably the day-to-day experience people would have with planning. And for most people, planning seems to be a very sort of remote, bureaucratic process that they have no input into or no control over. And I think that's an important thing we have to learn from the failures of planning in the past, that they didn't involve the people who are affected by the planning. They didn't involve the workforces properly. They didn't involve the customers or the service users, etc., etc. So I think that is something that we have to make sure that when we talk about democratic public planning, we get across to people that we're talking about a process, the core of which what Jonathan talked about, but also that it's going to be a much more responsive and dynamic process, more flexible process that's going to relate to what people's lives and what their needs are. And as Jonathan said, it's going to involve a lot of feedback from the people and from the experience of how things work out in practice. I'm actually just at the moment reading a very interesting book that Roy came across a group. Maybe he can mention something about this in Newham, in his area, and I won't talk about that. But anyway, the thing is that there's quite a serious movement in public policy internationally, where a left-wing, more radical section of the people who are involved in planning and in policy design and so on have come to the understanding that the way that it's being done in the past has been very remote and undemocratic, and they are coming forward with what they call co-production. And the idea is that you involve, from the very beginning, you involve the people, the citizens who are going to be affected by all the planning. You involve them in practical ways in that process of developing new policies, new designs and so on. And as a result, you actually end up with a much more effective and realistic program, and one that the population is happy with, or much happier with than before. So it's something we're looking into, this co-production, but it looks like a very serious movement, and we'll try and feed some of that into the manifesto process. Okay, Jonathan, Roy, I don't know if you want to say something about that, about what happened in your local area in regards to this. I don't know if you can hear me. You'll have to unmute yourself if you want to say something.
A bit
Roy,
tied up at the,
yeah.
I'm a bit tied. Yeah, I'm tied up at the moment, Pat, because Anne's suddenly been taken unwell. So I'm just having to listen on the as much as I can. I can't really contribute at the moment, if that's okay.
No worries. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
So maybe comrades like Yen might like to say something about what their experience has been in Ghana about planning, or the comrades in Pakistan, perhaps? Anybody want to say something about that? I think Khalid, maybe Khalid could say something as well, because Khalid, you were telling me that there's a big move against public services taking place at the moment in Pakistan because of these problems. Perhaps you'd like to say something about that.
Yeah, because in Pakistan we only experience the bureaucratic, the capitalist bureaucratic planning, and it's a highly top-down model, and there is no involvement. Even the parliamentarians or the parliament are not involved in the major decisions that have been made about the economy, health, education, and all. So it's a highly bureaucratic structures. Even when the nationalization took place in the early 70s, under the first PPP government, what they did was they took over, from the private sector and handed it over to the bureaucracy, the state bureaucracy. And they were not at all trained how to run the, the industries and services and all these institutions. And what happened was then, as the time passes on, the services, the quality of services fall, and it was crippled down. Most of the public sector institutions, there were, there was no innovation, there was no upgradation, no new investments being made. It was a worse form of sort of the running of the public sector, and how the bureaucrats, they plan it, they plan the things. As Pat, you have mentioned that when you don't involve, the people who affect from the planning or the decisions made by the state bureaucracy, so that's what happened. Because the bureaucrats, they have no real concern about like setting up a hospital or building a hospital. There is no consultation took place. The local people where the hospital needs the most, they never ask that. They are not being involved, and so the needs, the requirements of what the people need, they've been ignored, and the bureaucrats sitting in their offices, they decide, they make decisions, and most of the time, if we and that's why it's not a question of efficiency. It's also involves the question of wastage of the money, the resources that the bureaucratic decisions and planning, that cost. And we can see in Pakistan, the countries like Pakistan, where a huge amount of resources and money every year being wasted because of the bad decisions, because of the bad planning, because the people who are directly infected, like if we look at what is happening at the moment in Pakistan on the COVID-19 situation, the pandemic, the government is making decisions without taking on board or without asking the health experts, the doctors who are fighting that pandemic on the ground in the hospitals. And that's why, sometimes they wasted a huge amount of money and established centers where, they were not required. And where the resources were required, they didn't allocate resources to these hospitals, the public sector hospitals. So it's very important, as you mentioned, that the democratic public planning, they should involve each and every, sector or the section of the population in the planning, which could be directly affected by the decisions and the planning. And also, it's very important to involve, because I think it's now we need to go beyond the workers' control, and we need to involve customers. We need to, because there are, I think there are more people are now more conscious. Even the countries like Pakistan now, the governments were forced to set up consumer courts because people are now more aware of all these things. So it's very important to involve people in the planning, the people on the ground, and also to the day-to-day running of the the economy and the big businesses and so on. So I think it's, what Jonathan said is it's right. But we have now we can learn from what happened in Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and then China. So I think we need to think, and we need to include all these experiences and examples that we have to draw up a new program, how to democratically plan things. And I think Jonathan made good points, and the other comrades can also make some good points. So I think the simple thing is we need to emphasize the thing that the planning aspect, you said, in the countries like Pakistan is associated in the mass consciousness with the bureaucratic top model, and that's what we need to emphasize, how to democratize them. That's the more important question, because there are a lot of questions, and I think we need to come up with these answers, to these questions that has, yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, can I come in? Yeah.
Yeah, and go for it, man.
Yeah, I mean, just a bit on Ghana. We've had, I mean, after independence, our first government under Kwame Nkrumah engaged in a whole lot of import and export substitution industries. By this, he built a lot of factories, but one of the major problems about, even though it's held highly by most of us, is this top-down approach to planning. And then after the coup in 1966, most factories were returned to Ghana. But there have been some elements of large-scale factories, or whatever, or some businesses controlled by the state. But what has happened is that invariably, most of this state sector, like the national health, education, whatever, has been controlled by the educated elites, and the educated elites have used these institutions, for their own interests. For instance, we did have something during one of the regimes called a champion regime, called state development, regional development corporations. And most of them were managed by the middle classes, the upper classes. And then they were seen, most state institutions are seen by the people who occupy them as their own property. And I mean, and as the measure of COVID-19 is about, even in the present situation, resources that come into the state, because the middle classes or the elites control this thing, the state's industries. They use them, for their interests, and there's so much and high corruption. They're just seen as institutions of looting. So what happens is that you have the middle class that take over these institutions, loot them, and turn around and blame socialism. You get what I'm trying to say? They claim that these state institutions that they are managing are socialist institutions, when in actual fact they are not. They are just creation of the middle classes. They occupy them, share resources among themselves, in budgetary terms, when money is allocated to them, they just pick and share among themselves. And when the things become so bad, they turn around and blame socialism. Oh, look, your socialism has failed. They tend not to blame the fact that they are managing it. They don't involve workers' control. Even some of the state industries, when workers want to take part in the decision making, they fight against them. You know, they see them as their own preserve, a reservoir to generate income and profits for themselves. And that has been a very massive failure. So to us, some of us are, in Ghana, in our campaigns, we're saying, listen, they've never been socialism in Ghana. It's been colonialism, neo-colonialism, and new liberal colonialism. It's always been capitalism. The fact that the state has owned, or the state has owned some industries, does not mean that they have been under democratic control. The planning, most of the time, the planning have been top down, written by the managing directors and their deputies, and that has affected state industries. Even though at present, what is happening, most of them are being sold out. We have less and less and less sectors. The private sector education used to be wholly state, but now the private sector has entered so much into it. The health services that used to be a lot of state sector is heavily infiltrated. As for the state factories like the textiles and others, unfortunately, the cheap Chinese imports have destroyed most of them. From the town that I come from, we used to have meat, and then meat factory and tomatoes factory. All these are rice mills. All these are closed down. The whole idea is just the new liberal thing. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Jen. In fact, I think there was actually a documentary about the tomato producers in Ghana that I saw. Very good documentary. I think it came out last year, was it? So anybody can find that on YouTube. It's really good. It talks about what a crazy situation, and all the potential of production in Ghana, and how it's been destroyed particularly by the actions of the European Union. Mm-hmm. Okay. Another comrade like to come in?
Oh, yeah, hi. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just, I mean, your talk and including the elaboration from others, I'm thinking, you know, when we talk about planning, are we thinking along lines of micro planning, or what sets of policies and issue areas we focus on? I mean, I'm thinking from a practical perspective here, and I think maybe that's something to discuss as well. I mean, obviously, education, healthcare, and housing would seen commonly as the three major areas where that's quite important to the general public, to masses. Yeah.
Well, I think I think you're. I don't think it's just between macro and micro, is it? You've got planning at all kind of levels of society, haven't you? You know, you've got local government level. You've got regional level, you've got sector-wide planning, you've got government, economy-wide planning. So you've got planning at all kinds of levels. And so in that technical sense, I think I wouldn't just split it between micro and macro. I think maybe by micro, you mean like a very low level, like of a small company or something like that. I mean, even a small company, I suppose, has to plan things. I mean, I always argue with people. It's one of the ironies of what Jonathan points out, isn't it? That the capitalists, they inside their own organizations, they plan, and they They don't run competition. You know, they don't run a marketplace within their own companies. Okay, so the things that they control, they plan within it. They use all these methods and they coordinate. So they expect all their staff and their employees to work as a team, to cooperate together for the benefit of the company as a whole. So they don't run this competitive dog-eat-dog system inside their own companies. They don't run a chaotic, anarchic, unplanned system in their own companies. And then outside of their company, they argue for this. This is how it should be done on the whole of society. That's a weird contradiction, isn't it? Politically, that these people are arguing totally differently for society as a whole than they do inside. And I always give the simple, the simple argument that, you know, if you want to build something, say you want to build a house, anybody goes ahead and builds a house without involving an architect to plan it, or build a large building or something to plan it, needs a head examined, and most people accept that. They take it for granted that if you just go ahead and try to build something without trying to plan ahead, you know, how the things will work together, and how all you know, the water and the electricity and so on will work from outside and go through the building, and the loads of the different parts of the building, and how it will handle the rain and all the other things, then you're going to end up with maybe some parts of the building might be okay, but other parts will just be a ramshackle mess, and it will be totally inefficient. And that's basically, in a microcosm, what the argument about capitalism is, isn't it? It just doesn't make sense to not plan things. I give an example in my own area in Turkey, where my home is. We had a situation where the tourism industry was in a phase of massive expansion about 15 years ago or more. And there was a realization by a lot of people that there was a need for good quality hotels. And so in a sensible system, the government would coordinate that demand for different organizations who wanted to build hotels. But in capitalism, it doesn't work like that. It's like the Wild West. So we ended up with thousands and thousands of 4- and 5-star hotels being built, all by totally independent, separate companies. And so what did you end up with? You ended up with a complete glut in the market. And so now you've got, for the consumer, it's not too bad. But for the industry, it's a mess, because they don't make much profit. You get the cheapest hotel accommodation in the world is actually in southern Turkey, the region where my home is. And another example, the farmers in Turkey, it's a constant process that goes on, where the farmers are not doing very well, so they start to look for a new product, a new food to grow. So then they suddenly discover that pomegranates, you know, those things with the red seeds inside them, they suddenly realize that they're very popular, and they're also popular in the health industry, and they can be used for all kind of uses. So then what happens is there's no coordination, there's no planning. All the individual farmers, and this actually happened, I know, it's all surrounding me where my home is, they all suddenly decided to switch over from oranges to pomegranates. And the end result was that, guess what happened? An oversupply of pomegranates, the price of pomegranates, which were quite good, went down to rock bottom. So all the farmers who invested and planted all these trees and so on, then all started moaning, and then they start looking for another thing. And so you find this ridiculous process of underproduction, and that then attracts a massive amount of totally individual chaotic investment. Then you get overproduction, and then so we go from underproduction to overproduction, and it's just a mad way to run an economy. and to run a society. It doesn't make sense to not plan things. And of course, while all the major means of production are owned individually by separate individuals and companies, that is inevitably what's going to happen. And of course, this is also reflected itself in the business cycle, as they call it, the process whereby you get this massive burst of investment, which then they reach a certain peak, and then the confidence is lost, and then it goes into a downturn, and then a huge amount of things close down, and then the process starts again. It's a totally inefficient and chaotic way to run an economy. So that's one of the basic reasons why I always argue that planning makes sense. The only question is how can we make the planning work much better than the past?
They took all my bones to check. They did X-ray to check.
Hey, Yen, can you take off your microphone?
Through some machine. It wasn't through the tube, but something that moved up and down.
Yen?
Somewhere.
No. They are sitting there. The person is sitting there. It's like.
It's an X-ray.
It's an X-ray.
They do X-ray.
Yeah.
Oh.
So they did X-ray.
See if I can mute. I can see if I can mute Yen so that we don't have to listen to his medical condition. Yen? Hi, Yen. Yen, can you mute yourself? I don't seem to be able to mute you. Yeah? Thanks, man. Yen? Hello?
The vitamin D trait. My mind is just vitamin D.
I don't know why I can't.
The one I have got there is D3.
I think so. The one you take to a day.
Yeah.
Yen?
I think,
hello, Yen?
Pet, you have directly mute to all, no?
I know, but it's not working. I don't know why.
Yeah.
I'm not sure why.
I don't want to.
Go to the pharmacy by
If you ask, maybe to
Can't do it.
If it's D3, I don't even know mine is D3.
bone.
Bone health, yeah.
So, and then
Yen? Hello, Yen?
To check.
Yen, can you hear us?
Uh,
I can't mute him, unfortunately.
Back test. Send it.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's what they say. 5 years time.
I don't know why I can't.
So they said your bone density has reduced.
Mike, I see you come on board here.
Because yeah, vitamin D.
Well done, mate.
Yeah.
What's the one you're in the sun and not?
Is that for the sun? Yeah, because one time you're talking about
normally the host is able to mute people, but I'm not able to do that.
Density has reduced from.
Look at the option if you have to mute everyone.
I can't mute anybody at the moment. I don't know why.
Because my bone.
Yen,
Yes.
can you mute yourself? We can hear everything you're saying.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
No problem. Oh, great. Okay. Oh, that's brilliant. Okay. So, Mike, I see you come on board there. Unfortunately, you've missed a lot of the session so far. We've been talking about public planning. I don't know how much you've been able to catch. Can you hear us? Mike is from Guyana in South America. And he's a new addition to our network. So I'd like to welcome him. And I don't know if he can hear us. Maybe he can't, but anyway, it's good that he's logged on. Okay. Okay, any other comrade who'd like to come in, contribute?
If I can say something on where we should really not to planning in this sense. I was in the mid-90s called to advise as an expert on the reconstruction of housing that was destroyed by earthquakes. And the government was handing out some money to repair the damage. And we decided to have three plans. One, we could take over the house and repair it and give it back. The other was to provide for the people to provide us with plans, approve them, and through approved architects, and fund the repairs, and then just estimate the damage and give to the people the money to do it themselves. They would have to follow some rules, and you have just to check that they followed the rules. The first plan went disastrously wrong. I mean, it was expensive. People were complaining, and nothing was going right. The second, it was a bit better, but not much, because we had to quarrel with the architects, with the people, what to do, what not to do. The third one went beautifully. It went beautifully because people were taking the money, they were putting some money off on their own, and they were doing really beautiful work. I mean, not all of them. We had something 80 to 90% success, and 10 to 20% failure, in the sense that they did monstrosities. But the point is that this 80 to 90% success was really what saved us. People were satisfied, they did what they liked, and they mostly followed our advice. And we just had people to advise and help them. And that was the first time that I realized that on this level, when you have many small things to manage, we have to trust the people, and we have to give them the power to do what they like, and to make sure that they plan it themselves, not to try to impose top-down these things. I'm talking about this micro level of planning. I'm not talking about the big companies and the NHS, etc. But it's important to realize that we cannot plan everything, and we have to be careful where we draw the line.
Yeah. Good example, Demos, yeah. I think maybe at this point, Roy, are you in a better position to talk now? If not, then, Roy, are you in a better position to talk now?
Really, I'm cooking at the moment. Sorry. Anne's in bed. Anne's in bed here. We've got the kids around, and so I can't really concentrate, if you know what I mean.
All right.
Okay. Thanks. Bye.
Yeah, right. All right. Well, Jonathan, if you don't mind, I think this is a good point at which to ask you to come back, and perhaps you can and take some time, you know, because if there's issues here that have been raised that you think are worth responding to, please do so.
Well, one of the first things raised was the question of China, and I do think, due to the particular class balance of forces during the Chinese Revolution, they from the beginning established what one could call a dual sector economy. It existed one sector which was the dominant sector, but in terms of production it was the smallest sector, which was the state-planned sector. In China, they never planned more than 600 prices centrally, compared to the 6 million in the Soviet Union. And then they had basically autonomously functioning parts of the economy which had to supply food to the cities, but they were supposed to beyond that they were supposed to function autonomously. And that was the product of really the peasantry under the leadership of the Communist Party was the driving force of the revolution, not the working class. So the peasantry after the revolution had an entirely disproportionate social role compared to the peasantry in the Soviet Union, which was crushed by Stalin. And this came to form the character of the Chinese economy. These autonomous areas, when the collectives were dissolved in the late 70s, it was there that capitalism developed. Basically in the more backward parts of the economy, which is where the law of value works the best. And that is how you got this development in China of having a conflict between one sector, which is state-owned and planned, and the other sector, which is basically a sector run by the law of value. I think the Chinese economy is not a socialist economy. You don't have the dictatorship of proletariat in China. You have a bureaucratic regime which is in control. I think it could develop into a socialist economy. I think that the working class movement is very strong the labor movement is very strong in China, despite the existence of an authoritarian state, or perhaps because of that even. And I think a workers' movement could quite rapidly move towards a democratization of the economy and create a socialist economy, because China now has reached the high income level. I mean, the division into high and middle income and low income economies. China, in the process of 30 years, has moved from being a low income to being a low middle income to be a high middle income. In the last couple of years, it's moved into becoming a high income country. And this, of course, relevant to the question of discussion of socialism in the country. I mean, admittedly, China is the largest country in the world, a huge internal market. But because it is now challenging the United States and Europe also, capitalist countries, in one area after the other, technologically, the United Nations divides industry into 30 branches. China is the only economy that has substantial industry in all 30 of those branches. And in many of them, it is challenging. It's at the technological frontier at this stage. And that is why it's being isolated by the United States, which shows that, while socialism isn't possible in one country because it's going to be attacked, and of course a democratic socialist country would be attacked even more by the capitalists, because it doesn't just pose an economic threat. China poses firstly an economic threat to capitalist countries. For them, China is much more dangerous than the Soviet Union ever was, because the Soviet Union never challenged the United States economically. When you have, for years now, Chinese investments in the United States have been bigger than US investments in China. That's a kind of indication of the system of the thing, and they're doing investments, of course, in energy, but mainly in high technology, some in property and stuff like that. But the last couple of years, Chinese capitalists who have invested in football teams and property, fancy hotels, and like that in the United States have been forced to sell those off. But it is a huge challenge for the system. And of course, the smaller the country is, the less the chance there is to challenge, to be able to survive in a capitalist world. In a place like Vietnam, of course, which also has a similar type of economy and setup as China, actually can survive because it sort of allied itself politically with the United States against China, because China also tries to attack Vietnam. And there could find a certain space for itself, being non-capitalist country at the same time, as not being directly challenged by the United States. But that's as far as its technological level is very low. If Vietnam develops into a high technology economy, then the same thing will happen. Anyway, I want to lift out a few things about China which are relevant to the discussion. One is, I mean, Demos made the point, we don't have to build everything from the beginning, and there are management techniques and things which have developed which we can use also. And I think that's definitely true. I mean, that's the basis of what I'm saying, is so much has accumulated, so much knowledge has accumulated, so much planning has already accumulated with the system, and we can make that, we should use that. However, I would add that I've looked a lot at management systems in China, and they do function differently to Western companies. They tend to be much less hierarchical than Western companies. And the management tends to be much more flexible and tactical than Western companies. They react much more rapidly. And I studied the question. I think basically that is a reaction to the existence of the plan. Because the dominant school of management thought in the West was developed in the 1950s in the United States, called the Strategic Management School. The idea being that, you know, you get all parts of a company to move in the same strategic direction, and that it's very difficult to, it's like a moving, you know, a giant oil tank or something. It's very difficult to have it change direction. But that is like a kind of strength against the uncertainties of the capitalist system. So you need this kind of strategic type of management to keep everybody working in the same direction and getting strength that way. But in China, it doesn't work like that, because the strategy is taken care of by the plan. Companies know what is going to be happening in the next 5 years. They just have to study the plan, and they will know those are going to be the areas of investment. That is where things are going to be happening in the economy. That's where we must orientate ourselves towards. And they can afford to have less hierarchical, more flatter structures, which enable them more to quickly adapt to the changes in the economy, because they don't need to worry about the strategy. The state takes care of the strategy. The state planning takes care of the strategy. And that is, it's no longer a question of labor costs. It hasn't been for at least a decade, probably 2 decades. It's not labor costs which have been making Chinese companies more competitive in the world market. It's the high technological level and their ability to be extremely flexible in producing things that enables them to compete in the world market. Another interesting thing, I've studied innovation a lot, for example, and of course the socialist economy must be an innovative economy. Now just take one example, for example, in China, normally from moving from from the idea to the market normally takes years to achieve that. A lot of companies have succeeded in reducing that to 6 to 8 months in China. And they do that because they don't have a hierarchical process of moving from idea to the market. So, for example, you will have in the West, you will have a group which will think of an idea, and then it'll go to the management. The management might go ahead in that, and then it'll go to some engineers who will figure it out, and then it'll go down to the production level to understand how this can be produced. And then towards the end of that, once that's all, then it'll go to the marketing department, and then they will see how to market this. In China, they've developed a system where they have all parts of this process working parallel at the same time. And through a networking interaction, they cut down the time it takes to innovate, to move from having one product idea to actually putting it for sale in the market. And again, I think that's a product of the fact that you do have a strategic orientation of the central plan, and the concerns of management do not have to be based upon having to develop that strategic plan and to gather everybody behind their own strategic plan in order to keep, the ship going in one direction. So even management thinks, even if it's democratized, it won't just be a democratization of the existing hierarchical structure. It'll actually develop new networking forms of working together within the context of a general plan, which actually makes things more decentralized. Paradoxically, the Chinese economy in many ways is more decentralized than a lot of the big capitalist economies. I think, on the question of the profit motive, I think also that while it's true that the central plan does not have to, the companies, the state companies, they do not have to immediately respond to profits. They do not have to say, well, if we can show a profit in the next 3 months, that should be our aim. The state companies can go without a profit for 10 years or even longer if the state deems that that is necessary to do so. But in the final analysis, the workings of that company have to be judged by the market also, by having to sell things which people want to buy, and being able to do that successfully and responding to the price signals in the market. I think, Marxists call themselves, dialectical materialists. And what that means fundamentally is that movement comes from contradiction. And when we look at the capitalist economy, that's clear. You look at the law of value, the struggle over profit within a company between workers and the capitalist means it forces companies to try and invest in order to maintain their profits. They are also in struggle with other capitalists. And that is part of the dynamism of the system, is the conflict between the classes, the conflict between the capitalists, which drives the system forward, which drives investment, and therefore revolutionizes the means of production. So it's a dynamic economy based upon contradiction. And when we've talked in the past about socialist economy, suddenly we're supposed to have development without contradiction. At most, there's been some kind of abstract idea well, you know, the contradiction with nature, that'll be the driving force between the economy and nature. Well, perhaps that's not the best contradiction to base ourselves on, considering the mess that has been made of the environment so far. And I don't think that's a viable basis. I do think the driving force of a democratic planned society, a socialist economy, is based upon contradiction too. I think capitalism has another contradiction within it, which is also between the state regulations and between the market. You know, the state was essential in the United States for creating the railways, for example, which were fundamental for developing the economy in 19th century United States. Same with the highways in the 1950s, or the telegraph. All of those things were done with state money. And so the state has always had a role, but as has been raised here, it's had a subservient role. And there's also been a conflict between the state and the capitalists in various situations, and the interest of the state, which has also been a driving force. But in the final analysis, of course, capitalists have been the dominant part. So there's all these contradictions in capitalism. There will be a whole number of contradictions within socialism too. But the working class will be the dominant class. The state-planned sector will be the dominant part. But that will be in contradiction and conflict also with the private sector, whether cooperatively owned by individual capitalists, and the law of value will be in conflict with the planning principle also. Also, there will be conflicts within the working class, just like there are conflicts within the capitalist class. And the kind of the most efficient mode which the capitalists have developed in order to deal with those conflicts is to have a division of power politically and a balance of power between those. And so they can put people in favor of capitalism at the top of the different state departments and civil service and judges, the military, between the executive and the parliament, and the judges, and you have a division of power within the capitalist class, which, when it works, is an efficient system to deal with the conflicts within the capitalist class. When it doesn't work, you get instead one part of this power structure which rises and oppresses the other part, and you get a dictatorship of one form or another, and that's a way of reimposing the unity of capitalist class. It's not a very efficient way, but if it doesn't work in any other way, that's what happens. And of course, the working class also is divided between different interests. It's not necessarily at all the case that, of course, you have a fundamental common class interest, but you will have, for example, workers in a company, and we've seen that example in Venezuela, where you've had cooperatives that employ people, and there's been conflicts between the people who work in the cooperative and own it, and those that are just normally on a temporary basis employed from the outside. So the class have developed this division of power and the balance of power to solve this. And the working class, I think, will develop this naturally also. For example, Lenin emphasized the importance of trade unions continuing to exist. That is one part of the balance of power of the working class. Of course, you have the election of workers' parties. You have the election of, within the state-owned industries, you have the election of people from below, but you also have the appointment of people from above by the state in order to represent the general interest of the working class. And I think that will be able to lay the basis of a constructive solution of the conflicts of interest which exist within the working class too. Although there's a fundamental common interest within the working class interest within the working class too, just like there's a fundamental common class interest within the capitalist class, although they're in deadly conflict often with each other. So I think when we talk about democratization, it will grow out of where the workers exist and will express itself in various ways which together will make up a democratic way of planning. I think that, I think the question of Gramsci was raised, and I think in the tradition which we've been working in the past, I think he's been very much underestimated. I think the analysis of ideology is very central, which we should take on board also. Unfortunately, he had this kind of position because he was in jail all the time while the Stalin-Trotsky conflict was going on. He just continued like Marxists always have done in the past until you got Stalinism. He continued developing ideas, sitting there in his cell, you know, and he developed a lot of interesting ideas which were outside the framework of the conflict between Trotsky and Stalin. And unfortunately, it meant that, you know, neither Trotskyist or Stalinist had any interest in his ideas, and instead it became a kind of pastime of academics to kind of use his ideas. And I think there is a lot which is worth taking on board there. Yeah, I think I think I've covered not all the points, but most of the points. And if anybody wants to come back now, we have 10 minutes. If they want to come back, they can do that if they feel I missed it too much or something.
Thanks, Jonathan. That was great summing up there. A lot of useful material there. Now, Mike was trying to get in. Mike from Guyana was trying to get in, but he's not used to using the Zoom setup. I don't know if he's been able to do it now. You just have to go down in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen and click on the unmute button, so that there's no longer the red like line across it, and then you can talk. I don't know, Mike, you want to say anything? I don't know if you can get that done. Sometimes if you're using this for the first time, it might be that your setup is not, you know, the microphone is not working very well, or it's not often people find that. You have to go in and change some settings in the computer. So I'll try and contact you about that separately to make sure we can do a dry run for the next session. Okay,
Mike doesn't seem to be in the list of participants.
Okay, so maybe he could, because he couldn't do it. Maybe he wasn't able to carry on. And also, he's very busy at the moment because there's just been a general election in the country, a disputed general election with the allegations of rigging, and there's been a recount, and then the result has been challenged, and it's now going to the Caribbean court. So it's all up in the air. So he's very involved in that at the moment as well. He's got some comrades around him, which we hope to be able to involve in our network in the future, which I think will be very useful. And he's got lots of contacts around the Caribbean, which I think also be useful. Now, probably this is a good point at which to round up things, is to say that we have the next meeting is going to be not 3 weeks later, but 4 weeks later, same time, same day of the week, same time. And it's going to be Michael Roberts talking on democratic public investment. And I think that will be very interesting for us. Probably a lot of us haven't actually had the chance for a long time to hear from him in the flesh, so to speak, as much as you can in Zoom, and to ask him questions. And, you know, for any of you who've been following his blog, what's it called? Blogging from a Marxist Economist or something like that. He's performed a brilliant service over the years of commenting on and analyzing what's been happening under capitalism. And he's been pushing the idea of the need for public investment as the only way to get us out of the crisis. And he's going to be talking about that, and that'll be very, very interesting. So I'm looking forward to that. I think that kind of wraps things up now, doesn't it? We're pretty well near the end of our session. Anybody want to add anything or ask any questions quickly before we go?
One thing only, I'm very happy with Jonathan's roundup, except one thing. This question of profit, I think there we needed to discuss a lot more. I mean, I cannot really accept the need for a profit motive in the few large companies that will come under state control, in the sense that already today the big companies, I don't think they are working on a profit motive as such, but in the profit in the Marxist sense. They are really working on how to rip off each other and the world rather than anything else. So profit for this at this level of production, I think it's ripe to be thrown out of the window, really, and think of other ways of measuring the success and the production and the efficiency of companies at this level. But that's a discussion I think we should organize.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Demos is raising a good point there about how you would measure mathematically or financially the success of a state-owned company, so that you need some kind of measure, but whether it be in the old profit method or whether it be a whole series of yardsticks, one of which could be you want to retain a certain amount of money to reinvest and develop the technology of the company, but there'd be a whole number of other yardsticks in terms of employment and other things. But that'd be very interesting discussion in and of itself. All right, comrades, if there's nothing more, someone's put, Jonathan, I think, put up the link to Michael Roberts' blog in our chat. So if you want to, if you haven't come across Michael Roberts before, I thoroughly recommend it, and to to follow him regularly. And yeah, a lot of us here, I think we do follow that already, but there might be some people who don't. And I think a very useful session out of which we'll be able to utilize quite a bit of the material for the manifesto. All right. Okay. Thanks very much, comrades. Thanks, Jonathan. Great to see you, and goodbye to everybody.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Goodbye.
Bye. Thanks, comrade.
Keep safe. Keep safe. All right.
And wash your hands.
Okay, you too.
Hey.